applicable today. They are working on a second version of this that I believe is somewhere in press, is my understanding in my last discussion with them. So that's something that I think it's I think everybody should have a copy of this book at some point. But very simply, very basically, equity audits are a systematic way for school leaders, principals, superintendents, curriculum directors, teacher leaders to assess the degree of equity or inequity present in 3 key areas of their school or district. Program areas, teacher quality is a big area, and achievement overall, and how it's measured in different ways. These equity audits are designed to put streamlined, practical strategies in the hands of leadership practitioners at a time when such goals are sorely needed. So I want to start with this idea of how we're measuring the achievement gaps, or measuring achievement overall. We have a broad range, which at some point become a challenge, but I'll get to that here. We're talking about achievement test performance. We're talking about gifted or talented placement, grade retention or flunking out. I use those words on quotes. As well as the dropout or push out. We still use college preparation exams like SAT or ICT. We're also talking about essentially access to college and matriculation of college data. That's becoming more and more available across certain states. College graduation rates, obviously, is part of the conversation, also going on towards the other end of the pipeline, graduate record examination as well. And these are all kind of based and aggregated across different protected classes that, in a lot of cases, we can access how it looks across gender, how it looks across race and ethnicity, national origin, language, color, disability, age, sexual orientation, and gender identity. I put that in there because it is a protected class, although it's one grouping that we rarely ever see as how we're examining the inequities that our LGBTQIA students face in our communities as well, but it should be a conversation and a consideration in our work. But I want us to also get to, I mentioned the achievement gap on purpose and how to reframe it, because also in our practice and how we approach our work, we need to kind of move from this idea of our traditional assumptions about what explains these achievement gaps to one where we're moving over to more of a conversation of opportunity gaps. More specifically, we can move ourselves down from this kind of idea that this pathology or IQ, that some kids are either smart and other kids are just not as smart, or some kids work hard, some kids are lazy, or even blame them because of a culture of poverty. At-risk kind of assumptions, they become deficit and they're problematic, and then in the way that how we then approach our conversations then becomes critical as the first step to think about that some of our long-standing assumptions about what explains these gaps are very problematic. And it's an issue that we face at all levels. It's an issue that then shapes policies. It's an issue that then shapes practices in our schools, in our communities, in our districts. And it's something to very seriously give into some consideration as to moving ourselves away from our assumptions from that kind of effort over to more of a process of systemic inequality, to check that and essentially be able to respond more strategically to really address equity. So just I think I went back on my slides. So I wanted to highlight this long-standing kind of definition, and I like to use this a lot. President Lyndon Baines Johnson, in his To Fulfill These Rights commencement address at Howard University, said the following: "You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him up to the starting line of a race, and then say, 'You are free to compete with all the others,' and so justly believe that you have been completely fair. Thus, it's not enough just to open the gates of opportunity. All our citizens must have the ability to walk through those gates." I love this quote, not only because it's 1965, moreover, not just because it's at the Howard University, but also because it also speaks to this idea that here is a president in 1965 pushing us to really begin to understand what equity means. And we often, for a lot of us in the field, equity is a new term that has come about that's really been introduced to us in some cases because of Every Student Succeeds Act. But this is not a brand new idea or concept. This is something that has definitely been a big part of the conversation since the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. But what is equity? I wanted to kind of get more specific into the definition of equity and how I kind of make sense of it myself. I borrow on Booth's definition on a book around school finance that goes beyond pushing us from this idea of not just a level playing field of resources, which we see as horizontal equity, but vertical equity as a reflection of unique needs, demands, and approaches for diverse populations that requires unique and greater resources in order to achieve an equality of outcomes that lead to equal opportunities towards college access and success, career readiness, and overall participatory citizenship. My sense and my feeling about this is that this is something that, as a definition, that we should constantly reflect on when it comes to our work, when it comes to how we're playing out in our classrooms or in our schools. If we can continuously envision this definition and concept, I believe we'll be a step closer to essentially moving towards equity if we just constantly reflect on these ideas. Skirtle, McKinsey, and Sherrick defined equity strategies are planned, systemic, and focused on the core of teaching and learning process, curriculum instruction, and school environment, culture. And I want to highlight that the environment and the culture is critical. Educational equity activities promote the real possibility of equality of educational results for each student and between groups of students. So these are I think, important definitions and concepts for us to keep in our mind and in our work and our practice. So I mentioned earlier that for many, and this is a conversation that comes up often, is that Every Student Succeeds Act essentially really pushed now this idea of equity and providing accessible data around equity so that there's a greater sense of accountability. And this is a big conversation that we're seeing across states. Numerously, I get this conversation from district leaders or even state leaders, especially around 2016 as this policy was being put into place, and 2017, where the question is, we're trying to figure out exactly what equity means and how do we apply that and how we define that. So it really, the good thing about it all, for a lot of us who have been pushing for equity concepts in our work, that now we're seeing a boon for us to actually connect back into practice in our districts, and I see EAC, the Equity Assistance Center South, really getting busy, and the opportunity to really engage our districts and leaders with pushing for these equity concepts, which is great. But we definitely see that there's a huge demand, mainly because of policy, and that's the power of policy. And so it's important for us to know why we have this new equity policy conversation currently and where we're at. Basically, in a few sound bites, access to learning opportunities focused on higher order thinking skills was a big conversation of ESSA. Multiple measures of equity, resource equity, evidence-based interventions were key points to now where we're at around policy conversations. A big aspect of, and I think is central to any equity audits or any equity work, is what does teacher quality and equities look like, particularly around district implications, and what we mean by that, what is, when we're talking about educator quality or teacher quality, what does their preparation look like? What does their experience look like? What is their qualifications? And we have access to certain data points that begin to speak to us to say the percent of teachers that are certified in their area and teaching that area. And that's federally accessible through the civil rights data collection because it's a critical aspect of teacher quality, but a beginning conversation. We do have the issue of teacher shortages, especially when it comes to the conversations, how shortages then inform conversations around alternative licensure. Just recently in Maryland, we were having a conversation with the district and how they're essentially now dropping the total number of requirements that you need in order to be fully certified or licensed. And so what it means is now you're going to have a push for hiring teachers, more teachers that are even less certified with fewer hours from a college around teacher preparation. And what that then translates to is, well, who has the teacher turnover rates, and becomes a contributing problem into the type of schools that then are underserved by the type of qualified teachers that they have in their schools. So that's where we see some of these challenges as well. But all these, and then you see other dimensions that play out in teacher quality, and who they are is critical as a big conversation that we have as a cultural mismatch, and I'll get to that in a little bit. And what I mean by that is that the majority of our K-12 children in public schools today are essentially of color. But 80% of our teachers in the U.S. are white. So what that means is having a conversation as to what is that cultural mismatch and what does that contribute to. You can almost look at almost every district across the U.S., and sadly, our black student suspension rates are sometimes double or even triple that of any other group. And that's an issue that is a huge challenge in our system. It's something that we need to talk about, and it's something that we need to really address in our work. It also means about accessing other opportunities or even preferential treatment. And so these are issues and realities that are fortunate that we face, that we have to talk about in our work as we address teacher quality issues within our own equity audit efforts. And then also teacher inequities and how they're placed across districts. We know we're more segregated today than we were at the beginning of the civil rights movement. It's a big conversation that we need to have as to how does one school in one part of the district then fare better than the other part of the district. And we need to examine that, and there's opportunities for us to do that. And I'll get to a little bit more as to opportunities where we can do that as well. Why teachers of color matter? When it comes to this mismatch conversation, I really want to highlight this conversation because I think it's critical for us to think about how we are essentially recruiting and preparing more teachers of color, particularly to serve that over 50% male population of our students, of our K-12 students. But why? Why is that such important? We know that it's been a big part of even the civil rights movement. Black and Latino communities were demanding that teachers in their schools at least looked like and even speak like the communities they served. And that's been still the going conversation today. And what we see in some of the research that's highlighted that the cultural and linguistically rich assets that Latino educators bring to schools as cultural gardens are an essential contribution to development and growth of Latino children as they contribute a different perspective and a different outlook, a different quality to teaching practice that recognizes, values, and honors the legacy that my kids bring with them every single day. It creates a whole other kind of teacher. This conversation is very, very important in our communities and all of our districts. Now, that's a challenge that we're all facing. How do we address this conversation? And essentially, we don't have enough teachers in the pipeline already. We're already running shortages. And how do we essentially recruit and prepare? So this is a conversation that I think we need to take back in our communities, at our state level, and even at the federal level. I will give recognition to the Learning Policy Institute, who's pushing through currently a PREP Act, the preparation and retention of educators and practitioners. What it's really trying to do is provide federal dollars to essentially bolster how we're preparing more diverse educators, particularly supporting minority-serving institutions. It's also putting more funding into emphasizing what does that critically preparation look like, how should we really connect the dots for doing that, and they're trying to move the conversation forward in a critical way at the federal level. But know that there are definitely states who have done well with this conversation, particularly from highlighting the grow your own teacher models that have come up, particularly out of Chicago or Illinois more specifically. There's also programs like Call Me Mister out of South Carolina. Those are great examples that really show that if not the federal level, definitely at the state level, it behooves us to be engaged in this kind of conversation to address this particular area of inequity. I mentioned earlier that there are opportunities for us to begin we envision a equity audit of some sort as a good starting point. And I like using these slides, and I won't put the state on the spotlight here, but this is a conversation and something I see very common in these kind of numbers across states. So if you're at the school level or district level or state level, and this is data that we actually are comparing schools. And so even at a school level, you can begin to look at this level of data broken down by groupings in this way off of the OCR, Office of Civil Rights data collection, which is under your Department of Education. I've highlighted the address down below. But this is where you can begin to even compare educator data. You can compare from one school to the next and looking essentially, well, what is the first percent? What is the first year percent of teachers, right? In other words, the percent of teachers in your school that in your first years. You can even get second year teachers to get an overall idea as to what does that look like. You'll begin to see how that compares to the district level or district average. That allows you already to start have immediate conversations of what is that quality teacher aspect in the conversation. It also gives you an average teacher salary if you want to get an idea that's reflective of overall experience and overall educational, that essentially reflects that average salary within the district. You begin to see those numbers and how they reflect at least beginning conversations of when we're talking about the teacher quality perspective and how that plays out. You can compare that information. You can compare enrollment, completion, demographic, college prep information, AP coursework enrollment, and as well as passing. You can look at the percent of students that are in calculus or even algebra at the middle school level. You can look at some of the bilingual dual language learner information data. That's all infused into the Office of Civil Rights, and that begins your first step of essentially beginning your equity audit. But this is what I see commonly. If you look at the left circle, you see the school enrollment demographic breakdown. This is very reflective of a lot of districts, of a lot of schools throughout the U.S. as well. Well, we see a little bit over 50% of the student population is white, but in calculus, they're way overrepresented. And then you ask more specifically, who's underrepresented? When you look at Latino students, they make 22% of the population here. When you look at Black students, they're 9.3, Asian students, 7.2. But then you look at the calculus enrollment and how it breaks down in this school, and you see an extreme underrepresentation of Latino and Black students. And in fact, when you actually do the math, in this case, Black students here are less than half or 0.4 likely to be in calculus. And the same with Latinos, they're almost a third likely to be in calculus versus white and Asian students in this case are 1.5 likely to be, or 1.4 likely to be in calculus. So those are tough conversations that begins at the school level for us to have. Okay, this is what's playing out. How do we discuss this in that area? But here's another example where we see the out-of-school suspensions, where again, Latino students are overrepresented and Black students are also overrepresented in suspension rates. This is all data that can be easily accessible to then start those conversations. And again, this is a starting point, because then you can look at your own state data from your own states, and then you can also further analyze other test scores, accountability reports, achievement rates from that perspective, graduation rates, matriculation data. Then you can also break it down by gender, race, and ethnicity, IDRA 504 data, bilingual dual language learners. And also back to what I said earlier, that our GLBTQIA community, even though you're not going to find data for them in the system, you need to have that conversation as they are a protected class. How do we actually address and what kind of areas do we look at and examine when it comes to other groups that are not reported? So that's a starting point for a good equity audit. Now, something for us to think about as we go through this process of equity audit. And you need to ask these questions at every level. How do you develop that equity-oriented and equity-conscious teacher and leader? What does that process look like? And the book by Scarlett et al. Really brings some really good recommendations for having those conversations and really address the process of transforming your school district towards that equity-oriented or equity-conscious teacher, educator, leader, and so on. What is the professional development? How does it address direct disparities, such as teaching dual language learners centered on cultural and linguistic development across home and target languages? I can't tell you again how many districts, often when it comes to their accountability conversations, that they're deemed for how poorly they're serving dual language learners, but won't do any professional development to serve dual language learners at all in the district or in the school. And I see it as a huge gap. So even as an equity audit, you work a table and look at professional development when it comes to dual language learners. If there's a big gap, that's going to be a big glaring gap for this conversation. How can challenges to equity and/or equity traps be addressed? This is something that's also highlighted in the book that I think is really important. Back to those initial conversations of deficit thinking, the cultural erasure, where people are saying, well, race doesn't really matter. We're all human, and that's problematic and deficit. Some of our punitive practice and policies, where we want to put into policies that are problematic, where they are punishing and push out children, where either retention policies or other practices that are problematic that we need to also reflect on and in those processes as well. That at the end of the day, they come from a deficit thinking perspective. The cultural ecological models, and by that I mean like the cultural poverty explanations, which is problematic, and overall the cultural mindsets. Those take the process of transformation in our conversations and our engagement with our educators. Then, of course, considering the inequities, your systemic responses, what does that look like for not only self-assessment, but also continued monitoring? What does that look like for essentially looking at comparable information and data across courses, programs, or academic programs from over across schools as well in the district, to systemically address strong teaching leadership and support as well, equitable allocation of technology, instructional materials in school facilities, and I'm sure there's other areas that we can address into essentially creating like a form or even a table that says, okay, where are we in, when it comes to this particular area of inequity, where are we in these areas and how they're addressed? And how do you engage, moreover, constituents, particularly parents, in this whole process? They need to be at the table from the beginning, and you need to bring the community in, everybody in the community, because at the end of the day, you're going to be changing some things up, and you're either going to have some very happy people or some very upset people. And if you miss out on the opportunity to engage your constituents, it could be very problematic. Don't do equity by yourself. Partner up. I applaud Dr. Valle's work because he's partnered up with a lot of districts, across the state of Texas and then to Louisiana. And sometimes I give my other colleagues from different institutions a hard time that serve their areas, and yet Dr. Valle is actually doing work in their own backyards. And I say, look, Dr. Valle is eating your lunch. He's doing equity work in your communities, partnering up with districts through a number of grants, and it's just a realization you really can't take on equity efforts to truly be systemic on your own. And there's opportunities as well for how you can go by referencing some other examples, whether it's at the local level or even state level, regarding moving the ball forward regarding equity. So before I hand things over to Dr. Valle, so we can move the conversation forward, these are some common questions, and Dr. Johnson addressed this earlier in a nutshell, but this is kind of the conversations that we want to consider as we move forward to our panelists. How are equity audits, assessments for leadership development and organizational assessments critically important, and how do they look like in practice? This is really the conversation that Dr. Valle is going to highlight. What do state equity efforts look like in supporting equity audits and assessments for schools and districts? And moreover, how do they move towards systemic equity? How might district, state, and federal policy and research considerations look like when it comes to addressing equity? And that conversation is going to be addressed, as well as, lastly, I think something for us to think about at all levels. What are the political challenges of addressing equity, and then how do you address them? What partnerships might help specifically in this kind of work? At this point, I am now going to turn it over to Dr. Valle to give us a little bit more, and I'm going to click. All right, here we go. Oh, yes. Dr. Valle.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for handing over the presenter mode. Thank you, Dr. Rodríguez, for getting us going. It's great to be here amongst a community of scholars who continue to advance the work. Thank you for IDRA for having me here this morning. I have the great opportunity to not only represent community and partnerships, but more importantly in the sense of comunidad, but more important, represent my colleagues. We are a team of faculty who are equity-driven in coursework, not only in policy and law, but in practice. And it is a mindset. It is, as Dr. Rodríguez alluded to. So I want to share today some of the work that we have taken on these past years to really bring policy to practice to life, and then back to practice to policy, right, and what that looks like. So again, thank you for the opportunity to be here. As we move through this opportunity to present the information here, want to make sure I have access to our slides here in the next one. Okay. May need some technical assistance here to get the slides moving as we get started.
All right, Dr. Valle, we'll just run it over from our end.
I appreciate you. Thank you. Everything's always working except when it's time to get started for me to get the next slide going. Thank you. Go ahead, sir. So I will start where Dr. Rodríguez left off with Every Student Succeeds Act, with ESSA, and the policy and the law that drives a lot of the work that we're doing, not just because it's law policy, but the social justice mindset and the equity work that we drive and what that espouses to, what that really leads us to move the work in there. And ESSA, really drives that opportunity to really look at our most minoritized students, our most neediest populations. Dr. Rodríguez gave a great overview of what the equity audits are and what they look like. And so when we start in our coursework, if you think about a practicing teacher, again, and I'm going to go back to what was just highlighted, we have a large proponent of teachers that are receiving minimal, at best, preparation to come into our field because we need them so desperately. They may get a year on-the-job training, whatever that training looks like, and they come in to work with our most neediest of students. And so they're looking not only at their content and their pedagogy, but they're adjusting now into a world to advance equity. And how do you do that with disadvantaged and high-need students, as ESSA alludes to, right? So when we talk about that, and my focus here is to really address the needs of English learners and the needs of special education, special ability, GT, 504, our students at both tail ends of the spectrum that get left out because of their culture, because of their background, because of their language, because of their ability. So as we look at some of the highlights here, we look at what those high academic standards mean, right? That we want all students in America to be taught on high academic standards, that ESA really takes us into that area. We want to ensure that the vital information is provided to educators, families, students, and communities. This is what Dr. Rodríguez alludes to, that you need partnership. And partnerships are let's put it on the table. Partnerships take constant work, and you have to build trust, and you have to have communication, and you have to come to the table, and you have to address things. That really allow the work to happen. And an equity audit is a tool that we use not only in our coursework, in our training, in the work that we do in our partnerships. It becomes a really great opportunity to bring the data to life, to bring the populations to life, and not just stop with the quantitative element of you've got this data that's shocking you, so we're not going to freeze on it. What is it that we're going to do? What is it that we can do to really help our students and our teachers and school leaders especially to move this forward? So as we look at this last element here of what can we do for these expectations, that there will be accountability and action to effective positive change. So this is where we take advantage of this in our program when we bring teachers into to prepare them into preparation programs and to be future school leaders, that we begin with that mindset, that effort. Where are they going to put the effort? Where are they going to be able to do this work? Next slide, please. So the opportunity here for that mindfulness, that effort, we begin, as Dr. Rodríguez alluded to, is that equity audit, right? That becomes synonymous with our programming and our teaching here in our program at Texas Tech. And it's not just one assignment. It's not just a class that I took because we do this, or I did an equity audit and it stays there. This becomes a verb and an action. This becomes something that's going to be that work that move across the trajectory of the program. So in the first year, we build that capital, that mindset, that effort, if you will, of what that does for a teacher who's really looking at the school differently, who's looking at now from an assets-based perspective of the work that an equity audit brings. So in that first year that we have the opportunity to work with teachers, we're really making this not only a skill, but part of the will. So the skill becomes that quantitative element of looking at your marginalized population, looking at discipline very differently. It becomes the why, as we see here. If I'm going to be a social justice leader, if I'm going to do this every week, if I'm going to do this every day, how can I do this? What we really have to go to the why and the essence of this ethic and this moral compass of what we're doing with our students in the classroom. So the teachers, then we begin to have that partnering conversation with the districts and the teachers of this is where your data is, where can we focus, where can we really be specific and grow with the populations that need that help. So to really begin that growth for a teacher in the school leadership in that culturally responsive school leadership. We also use our colleague Mohammed Khalifa's work to build that CRSL, to build that culturally responsive school leadership. And Mohammed really brings at these attitudinal traits of culturally responsive school leaders. So when we look at those attitudinal traits, we really begin to couple those with the effort of the mindset of that social justice leader, of that culturally responsive school leader who understands the power of equity works and can start with a skill using equity audits to really move that forward, right? Well, what does that look like when you talk about courage to do the work, humility, deference? What does that look like in schools? What does it look like in my pedagogy and content when I'm teaching and I'm working, not only as a faculty here at the university, but that's the challenge for our teachers. You might be the only one doing it, but you're going to do it, right? What does that distributive leadership context mean, right? Where you're empowering others and you're bringing in as you decolonize the work, and you really get into that humanizing element. It is a journey. It is part of that attitudinal school leadership effort that where you have the will to do it, now you have the mindset and the effort, but now you need the skill. You also need that equity audit work to be able to do that. So as we move to advocacy and action, thanks for the next slide, please. Thank you. We look at really, again, an overview breakdown of what that equity audit does for teachers becoming aspiring school leaders, right? We really look at the teacher equity of their education experience and their class placement, We're taking our most, the teachers with the less experience and putting them with the highest need. That's a trend that, we see all across the country, and it's a pattern. Because I'm a tenured teacher now, and I've risen to the ranks to work with advanced placement, to work with IB, to work with the most talented, solid students. We put our most neediest students with our most neediest teachers, right? And we're watching them sink and swim. So we really begin that conversation, a very powerful one, of what's the practice on your campus and what's the practice in your district, and why is that allowed? So we really start that teacher quality with practice in that pedagogy. And when we look at the programmatic equity, and Dr. Rodríguez shared a great example of what those data graphs look like, we really look at the teachers. They have to reflect in their own classroom first. Before they're going to coach and grow others and build equity and build school leaders and graduate a program and get certified and licensure and move into that school leadership role, we have asked them to be reflective practitioners and really be that culturally responsive school leader in their own classrooms. What am I doing? How do I address discipline? What are my numbers look like? Do I have a bias towards boys of color? Do I have a gender bias? How do I address and how do I support my English learners in my own classroom? What about my special needs students, my students with different abilities, my special ed students? Are my GT students ignored? So all of this work, before it becomes external, becomes a really powerful place of being internal. So this is where, if we think about it from a program standpoint, that the equity audit is programmatic work, it really has to start with the teachers in their own classroom to build that equity lens and that equity work and really understand that they have the skill, they have the mindset and the will, because we all want to do the work, but you have to have the skill to embrace it and do it. And this is where the opportunity comes to use the skill building framework of Scrala and colleagues and scholars' work with equity audit with a mindset, for example, philosophical and cognitive space that Mohammed Khalifa's work challenges on to do that. So it's a very empowering space. It's a very critical one. It's a very difficult one, because to change adult mindsets, we know, is an ongoing process. It's a cycle. It's a really intense work. And let's be honest here, we get a lot of pushback on different, climates and cultures, but this is an individual journey. This is one that is very powerful for our folks in our program. So as we continue, thank you, sir. Next slide. We look at, who in our pipeline is. We have to think about that in our educators out in our districts and our communities working. So when we have teachers come into our program, we really look at, in the past, we're always building partnerships with districts to have these conversations. One of the first things they're going to do in the program is actually conduct an equity audit, right, on their school, on their district, in their classroom, right, to really understand that root cause analysis. They're going to learn these skills and to really do this work. and what that looks like. And as they practice in their own classroom, they begin to take and really push this data into professional learning communities in their classroom and schools. So who are the people that are doing this work? It's the teachers in the daily, and it's the principals guiding this work. So as we create an intentional pipeline for leadership, not only in our school districts, but as with our partnerships, and we know that's a need. We know that's a need everywhere that we work. So as we look at that, we really push our teachers and our programs to really understand this focus and this lens and do the skill building work so that when they become principals, they're able to do that. So as you can see here, also when we have principals and school leaders, district leaders in our doctoral program, we approach the same frameworks, content, to that level of district and superintendent leadership. Our colleagues will be teaching class, and they will be having equity audits at the district level, financial audits, and who and where they're investing and how they're developing human capital and the resources to support our most marginalized population of students and the students that we've been talking about, especially students of color and our special education populations. So we really do this across our programs intentionally, not only in our master's program, but in our doctoral program. Again, so that the problems of practice addressed daily by school leaders, by our policymakers, by our folks at the district level, really align with the skill building of the equity work and the equity audit, so that they have that framework to be able to guide and help with the decision-making process to really advance the work for our students. So that is an intentionality of the work. So thank you. Go ahead, sir. You're right on the money. So the opportunity here, for example, this chart shows what one of our students and one of our teachers will be doing to answer those questions. Why are inequities happening, right? Why are these things happen? What do you do after the audit? Well, we did an equity audit. What are you going to do with it the entire school year? Not just because it was an exercise, not because it was a PD. Each one of these slides can take a week. I mean, it's a whole day of training for us. Each area that I'm sharing is deep developmental processes here. But when a teacher is creating a SMART goal, right, and looking at data through a SMART goal and looking at teacher data, student data, and tracking very specifically from discipline to English learners and really impacting individual student needs in their classroom, and then as a department or grade level, then the transparency and the skill starts to build. Then we can address the inequities and why they're happening. And we do that through instructional leadership. We do that through the realm of culturally responsive school leadership. But more importantly, what does the coaching and the feedback look like from the principal level to the teacher level when you're doing this work? Because many times these are not normal conversations that are happening in our professional learning communities. They happen maybe once every 9 weeks, but they're not going in constant. So we're always progress monitoring. My colleagues say, Dr. Leah always says to us, what's not monitored isn't done. And so if it's going to be a check in the beginning of the school year and the end of the school year, why are we surprised that our populations didn't get supported and ignored? So this is, just some mindset and some numbers as an example of what students would be doing and looking at to really guide the work quantitatively, but then quantitatively, and then get in there qualitatively to ask the questions, to look at the pedagogy, to look at the rigorous curriculum, to look at the practice of what that's doing, because that's the work that goes on weekly as we do. Next slide, sir, and I'll obey my time. Thank you, guys. Next slide. Thank you. And finally, this is an aerial overview. I appreciate the technical help here. We go through these cycles as we look at the equity audit in our program and in the field. We're always starting with that knowledge base of what is it, how do we use it, and build the skill. And that really comes with looking at populations in the class, in the school, and moving that through this experience. But then you get to the action, to advocacy and action. How are we going to improve this? What are we going to do with the information that we have? And how does that how do we bring that policy into practice as we do? How do we infuse that, the rigorous curriculum, into our PLCs as a collaborative team of teachers, right? And finally, what is the impact over that school year? How did we progress monitor equity work, right? How do we impact advocacy and action and growth when we collaborate with teachers, when we collaborate with students and the community, and we bring in this collaborative, as my colleague, Dr. Adam Almaguer says, it's a lattice, right? We have to start with a lattice of social justice leaders, of community, of partnership, of parents, to really get all those stakeholders involved, to be transparent with this work, because it's not easy, but we need everybody's support in there. Thank you for the opportunity to share some of the work that we're doing. Thank you for the technical support. I appreciate y'all. Thank you.
I think I'm on. Okay, so hello everyone, Leah Walker. Thank you, Dr. Valle. That was outstanding. You'll be getting a call from me on some future work we can do together in Virginia. So I'm going to talk about what it can look like at the state level, and I'm going to go to the next slide. Let's see, is it moving? Okay. So, we went back. We went too far. It's not a meeting unless there's a technical difficulty. All right. So, in Virginia, we really have thought about what does the future of education look like in Virginia. And as we all know, the future of education is now. And so I wanted to start off the talk by really just framing the conversation around what we believe are fundamental competencies that every student in the Commonwealth must possess. And then we'll talk about how we are evaluating that across various student groups and applying an equity lens to the outcomes we're looking for. So in Virginia, we've identified 5 critical competencies that we believe are critical for every student to possess in order to be life ready after graduation. So regardless of what their course will be after they graduate from high school, we're really thinking about what are the critical competencies they must possess in order to be successful. That's pathway to college, directly into career, the military, which is big for us in Virginia. So those 5 competencies include communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and to be community-minded citizens. Critical and creative thinking, excuse me, and to be community-minded citizens. Those are the critical 5 components, or what we call in Virginia the 5 C's, that every student must possess in order to be successful in life after graduation. And we call that the Virginians for Learners campaign. So to that end, as we thought about how do we really operationalize our philosophical belief around education in the Commonwealth, a new office in our department was formed, which is the Office of Equity and Community Engagement that I lead. So I don't want to read verbatim off the slide, but essentially what our office does is lead and advance equity work across the state. So we do that through a myriad of ways, which I'll get into more detail about. But the primary thing that we try to do is frame and provide a consistent understanding of what we mean when we say equity. And so a lot of people will show the visual of, children standing on a box. We don't like to do that in the Commonwealth, or I don't, at least we don't use that. Instead, what I say is that equality is when you give everyone a shoe, but equity is when you give everyone a shoe that fits. And what I have found is most helpful in trying to help my colleagues across the state at the local division level to really understand this in a way that is relevant to our everyday lives is I think about how I explain this to my children. So my daughter always asks me about my day and what I'm doing at work. She's 12, and so I have to bring it down to a very rudimentary level for her to understand. And the way I explain it is that we both wake up hungry in the morning, and I have 6 bananas to satisfy our hunger. She is a growing girl, so she needs 4 bananas in order to be full and ready to go to school, eager to learn. I only need 2 bananas because I'm an adult and I don't need as much sustenance in the morning. What is equal is for me to give us both 3 bananas. But when I am practicing equity, I give her 4 bananas because she needs 4, and I give myself 2 because I only need 2. And that is really how we have to reframe how we think about the deployment of resources to schools and to students. If we do that with an equity mindset, we approach that work not in a way where we're giving more to some and less to others. We really are approaching our deployment of resources based on actual need and making sure that the needs of every student are met at the time that they need them. And so that's how we define equity in the Commonwealth. I'm trying to move to the next slide. So in Virginia, we've defined equity as every student getting what he or she needs to be successful at the time that they need it. So that doesn't mean that we wait until a student is not reading on grade level or grade to develop interventions to address that need. We really want to meet the student's needs at the time that they are identified and provide the supports and resources necessary when a need has been identified. One of the things that we are evolving, though, as we think about how we define equity across the state is this definition is really developed at the student level. And I think that that is great because it gives an aspiration for our students. However, because we're a system of public education, it's also necessary that we think about how do we define equity at a systems level. And so that's going to be our work over the next couple of months, is really reframing this definition to apply at a systems level. So what does an equitable system of public education look like in the state? And that definition should be very different than what we see here on this slide. Okay, so part of the work that we did was, Okay, I'm hearing that you guys cannot hear me, so I'm going to close the camera, and hopefully that will help. Cristóbal, please text me and let me know if is that better? Okay. So part of the work that we've done in the Commonwealth is we have established equity commitments for the state. And this really is how we guide our work and frame our priorities for how we're going to achieve equity. It's important to note that for us in Virginia, equity is not an initiative of the Commonwealth of Virginia. As we view it, equity is the way through which we deliver our work across the state. And that means that it touches every component of everything that we do as a state Department of Education, whose role is to be a partner with our local Departments of Education or a local school division and provide support to our local school division. So to that end, we are establishing clear equity goals for the Commonwealth that can be measured and where we will monitor their progress over time. So this really goes to Dr. Valle's point about what gets measured is what gets done. And so it's really, really important that we have a clear vision of equity that aligns to the things that we are actually measuring and aligning our accountability to. We're focusing on teaching and leading in the Commonwealth, and so as a part of our work, we recognize that while teacher diversity is critically important in the Commonwealth, our data is astronomical as it relates to this, and this is something that we do measure. Our teaching workforce is 82% white in the Commonwealth, where our student population is 52% students of color. And so that certainly is problematic. We know that we don't have the time. There's not going to be a huge influx of diverse teachers into the workforce, though we are working on that. So it's really critically important that we also advance the cultural competencies of the current workforce that we do have. So to that end, the State Department of Education will be partnering with an institution of higher education to develop a cultural competency platform and PD that can be deployed statewide for our teachers. And then long-term goal for this is that it becomes a part of teacher renewal licensure requirements in the future, that every Virginia educator must complete some cultural competency training in order to renew their teaching license in the Commonwealth. That's obviously longer down the road, but that's what we're aiming for with this work. We're also focused on our curriculum and instruction. We have a really important announcement that will be made in the coming weeks around what we're doing for our curriculum. But in addition to that, we really are looking at how do we ensure that every student has access to a high quality teacher. Our data is probably like most data across the country, and this is something that we do measure going back to those metrics that we talked about. We've started looking at what is the ratio of first year and provisionally licensed teachers in our highest minority and highest our divisions that have the highest percentages of low-income students. And what we see in that data is that students who attend a school where more than 50% of the student population are economically disadvantaged are twice as likely to have a first-year teacher or a provisionally licensed teacher in their classroom. And that is just not acceptable. And so our state board is doing some very interesting work around resource equity to look at how funding formulas can be modified to address that issue. And that ties right into the next bullet on the slide on resourcing schools. So our board has been doing a significant amount of work around looking at how we resource our schools, how the funding formulas work, not from the standpoint of what the General Assembly actually appropriates in the budget, but looking at the regulatory processes that the state has in place around teacher ratios and other requirements that the board has sole discretion over, and how they can drive resources to more resources to the highest need schools. Okay. So what is our work ahead? We'll continue to measure our outcomes, develop and deploy resources, and disseminate best practice, facilitate an equity dialogue. This is all of the work that we've currently been engaged with and will continue to do. I put this slide here because I think that this really does frame why it's important to measure and share dialogue about what our outcomes look like, and that is that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And I wanted to just give a quick example of kind of how we do this in the Commonwealth. So this slide shows English pass rates across the state for students. The redder the map is, that represents essentially a failure rate for that particular student group. And what you see is that for our students with disabilities, the entire state is red. For our Black students, the majority of the state is red. Economically disadvantaged, about half of the state is red. And so we started presenting data like this for the first time about a year ago, and it really did shock people. So data visualization is a really important component of how we have and advance an equity conversation across the state. It's not just enough to measure data. It really, really is critically important in how you present data in a way that can tell a true story. And so I wanted to show this as an example of how we are approaching that in the Commonwealth. And then talk about some of the things we have on the horizon. So again, I talked about our board's work. We are convening an Ed Equity VA community of practice across the state that will have a statewide and regional structure. And then we are launching a series called Ed Equity VA, which will be a webinar series that will occur monthly. And we are doing this in partnership with IDRA and other partners across the state, which will feature various topics each month to advance our equity work. So our first one is August 13th. We already have over 100 school leaders across the state registered for that webinar. And this is the schedule that shows some of the topics that we'll be addressing through our webinar series. And then there's my contact information at the end. If you'd like any additional information about what we're doing in Virginia, please do reach out. Thank you.
Okay, so we're just actually moving on to Morgan's presentation now, and her slides should be opening up soon.
Are they open?
Yes, ma'am. I'm going to switch over to you now.
Fantastic. Great, thank you. Is it hard to hear me also? Because I would love to turn off this video so that I don't have to see my own face.
Well, no, I can see and hear you beautifully, so.
Okay,
yeah.
great. Then I'll just keep going. Hi, everyone. So nice to join such a great group of people to talk about such an important topic. I'm going to be covering how we can use policy to assess and address equity in schools. I am the National Director of Policy here at IDRA, and so I work on our efforts to influence state and federal policy in a number of ways, including making sure that we're connecting with communities who are directly impacted by education policies, putting out useful materials for those communities and for legislative offices, and really looking at proposed policies and existing policies very, very carefully to ensure that they are considering and not blocking equity in schools. And so just before I get started to sort of frame the discussion, we know that at every level, policies can impact and are influenced by considerations of equity in schools. And like I was just saying, we can use policy to either block access to equitable and excellent schools for students. We can use it to expand access to equitable and excellent schools for students, or we can approach it, and as many do, in a way that's sort of ambivalent or crafted in a way that there's this commitment to facial neutrality when really it can create problems down the road for specific groups of students. And so it's important to consider all of those approaches and make sure we are really pushing for the ones that are explicit about equity and the creation and expansion of equity in our schools. And what we really believe at IDRA, as many groups do, but it's really important that every person believes that they are a policy advocate and feel empowered to use policy as a tool to influence equity in their schools, and believe that they have a voice in equity conversations. This is just my bio. We can skip through that. Okay. So as I mentioned, there are really a number of levels and levers for change when it comes to addressing, existing and proposed policies and influencing what those are. So obviously there's the federal level, the state level, and the local level. And within each of those levels, we can see examples of policies that truly impact schools and students and have a particular impact on poor students, on students of color, on students with disabilities, on LGBTQ students. And so it's important for all of us to be a part of those conversations at every level. So for example, at the federal level, we know we have ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. There are a number of federal laws related to funding, including Title I and Title III. There are now obviously many discussions around the decennial census that is coming up and the impact that that will have on particularly funding and representation that affects students in schools. And of course, these examples that I'm giving overlap with each other. And so some of these policies are influenced at multiple levels. But at the state level, states control school funding formulas. Often states control safety, discipline, and policing and what that looks like in our schools. State law can control data collection and publication. It can influence testing and accountability systems. And then we have the local level where often taxing decisions are made that impact the amount of funding that goes to schools. There are funding variations even within campuses within the same district. So we'll see, PTAs being able to raise money. So within the same district, you have one school on one side of town that looks very, very different from a school on the other side of town. And of course, local decisions control things like campus boundaries, who goes to what school, how housing segregation impacts school segregation. And so there are many opportunities. This can actually feel a little overwhelming because it is, but I think that the wonderful thing is that there are many opportunities for all of us to participate in changing and influencing policy and making sure that we are keeping equity for all students in mind when we do that, and we are, amplifying the voices of everyone who will be impacted by these policy changes at every level. I could spend a really long time talking about policy. I love thinking about how we can push for systemic changes, but I just, in the next few slides, will give a few examples of how we can view policy work as a way to assess and address equity in schools. So this is just one of the next 3 slides with the same general thought. How can we make policies work to advance equity? And I want to give a couple of ideas of the questions that we can ask when we're looking at existing policies or when we're thinking about changing policy. And again, these are just a few of the many, many questions. There's lots of research that should be done, lots of folks that need to be involved in the conversation, understanding where power lies so that the right people, you're talking to the right people to try to influence the change that you want to see to impact equity in schools. But these are just a couple of examples. So one question to ask is related to data. What are the data? How are they likely to change with the proposed policy? How can these changes be tracked and made available to the public? And are the data useful and actionable? So a good example of this is ESSA. So the Every Student Succeeds Act requires data reporting through a report card system that's designed by each state. And so this is an example of policy at the federal level that also trickles down to what states are doing and what local school districts are doing. And so this is an example of a time where it is critical for us to push to be thoughtful and use policy and developing policies to really set up the work for future policy. So having the right data, as Leah was just talking about, and presenting that data in the right way can really help people understand where there are issues and why it is important to address issues. So we should think about the type of data that are reported, meaningful disaggregations. Are we capturing the right groups of students in data? It's one thing to just give blanket aggregate data, but if we don't talk about the data as it relates to LGBTQ students when that is appropriate to collect the data as it relates to Black students or Latino students or English learners, then we miss an opportunity to make data really useful for the changes that we want to see. Do we have a clear and useful presentation of the data? So often numbers mean nothing if you don't have useful visualizations that people can really connect with and understand. Are there thorough definitions? Is there a clear explanation of assumptions that are made in the data? Again, data is not useful if the families or the educators or the advocates who are looking at it have a bunch of questions that are unanswered, or if the definitions the definition of terms are not clear. And so these are questions to ask of policies, and of this policy in particular, because I know some states are still in the process of developing what these report cards will look like, where we really have an opportunity to influence those policies and ensure that considerations of equity are front and center. Let's see. There we go. Here's a second set of questions to ask about an existing or proposed policy. How will people avoid compliance, and what are the unintended consequences? So this is an example of a state-level change in Texas as the example. In 2015, a law was eliminated that criminalized truancy. So at the time, Texas was one of only 2 states that criminalized young people who were chronically absent from school. It was a Class C misdemeanor, which means that kids had to go to adult criminal court, and that was just a special situation that happens here in Texas. So if you get a Class C, even if you're as young as 10, you go to adult criminal court, you face fines of up to $500, and you have potentially a criminal record. And so that law was eliminated in 2015, but then in some places there was an increase in ticketing, in the same Class C misdemeanor ticketing for juvenile curfew violations, which are essentially the same offense. And so it's really important as we consider how to use policy to assess and address equity issues to make sure that we aren't tackling a problem without providing a workable solution. It's really tempting to just say this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, and I actually love doing that, but it's also important to say, and here's what we do to support schools and students and educators to make sure that they know what a research-based meaningful alternative is that is useful to them. We have to make sure that that we are carefully articulating the root cause of a problem. And that becomes important because I really think it's important to lay it out there in the world why we're doing what we're doing, so that when workarounds from the other side come up, we can say, look, we know that treating students this way is problematic. You have come up with a new way to sort of that is harmful for students. And if we go back to our articulation of the root cause of a problem, we can really sort of cut off these workarounds and unintended consequences. So whenever possible, I think it's really important to get that down in policy, whether it's through some articulation of legislative intent or just, really clear articulation of the research and why we're doing what we're doing. And then also, it's important to be really careful about stretching of resources and make sure when you're formulating a policy, you have the people and resources in place to actually enact that, or else you do open things up, and the same students who you hoped would benefit from the policy change could be the very ones that suffer from the unintended consequences after the change. Sort of the last consideration as an example of all of this, of using policies to advance equity. I like to ask what the real world implications of a seemingly neutral policy are, and how individual biases and institutional deficiencies can be triggered by the policy. So the example I'll give is school district dress code policies. And so this is often a local issue. And I'll give an example of a school district in Central Texas that had a dress code policy that's similar to many across the country, that included things like no spaghetti straps, no red and blue colors. And really the roots of these changes were related to what I think was a racialized fear of gangs for the red and blue colors. And then also a culture when the dress code policy was implemented of really shaming girls and victim blaming for assault issues. And so there was a lot of work done by community-based organizations in the local school district to change this policy because it had really horrible, there were really horrible outcomes for certain groups of students, even though the policy seemed really neutral on its face. And so girls were more likely to be targeted by this policy. Black students, because of the racial assumptions that were made related to who was involved in a gang, were more likely to be targeted by this policy. And really, stereotypes about these students were triggered by the biases of the educators who were punishing students for dress code violations. The policy also really ignored some really serious issues with poverty and what students could actually afford to buy and wear that were influencing their ability to comply with the school dress code. It ignored situations for homeless students who literally sometimes could not wash clothes that and were forced into non-compliance with the school dress code. And so there were a number of student groups that were targeted by this policy, and once that was really uncovered and brought forward, there was a meaningful policy change. And so those are just sort of three examples of types of questions to ask when we think about policies and when we really and truly want to consider equity in our policy work. the last slide, just as a little pick me up to the attendees. We're all policy and equity advocates, and I know that many of you already engage in policy advocacy, but I think it's important to remind every single parent, every single student, every single educator, everyone in the community that you know, we all need to do this work. We all need to tackle systemic issues through policy, and it's important that our voices are heard because often policy decisions are made without everyone at the table, as all of you know. And so I think we not only have the right to be part of the conversation, but we also have a responsibility to the students who are often left out of the conversations, but who are most impacted by education policies, to ensure that those policies have equity in mind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Morgan and Dr. Valle and Leah and Cristóbal. I am just delighted for the conversations that we've had this morning. Your presentations have been very informative and actually motivating. Morgan, you're right. We're all policy and equity advocates. I think that sometimes we tend to rely on others to do parts of the work, but here at IDRA, we truly believe that you have to cross what we call crossing the borders between research, policy, practice, and community engagement. And so we wanted to field any questions. We still have about 9 minutes allotted for our time. And if anyone has questions, we will take them at this time. Thank you to Michelle. You can't see her. The chat box, if you open up the bubble with the chat bubble, you'll be able to post questions. Sorry, Dr. Christie, I just am now seeing your message, but you have the floor, participants, to ask any questions that you have. Jose did ask if we were going to be posting this online, and yes, we will. If you look in the chat box, you will see, if you scroll up, we will be posting this as soon as it's ready for production at www.IDRA And Leah, we have a question from Alpa Sridharan. Did Virginia conduct an equity audit before setting equity goals?
I think that we did do that. Thank you for that question. I don't know that we actually named it an equity audit, right, but we began with looking at our data from an equity lens and looking at data in a very different way. One of the other things that happened that precipitated some of this work around establishing equity goals was some very significant reforms to our state accountability system that began measuring achievement gap for the first time in state accountability. And so we had always measured and reported for federal accountability in compliance with the law, of course, but it wasn't a part of our state accountability system. And that change was implemented about a year ago. And so with that change, it really shifted and demanded a new focus on equity outcomes for all students. And so what we have tried to do with our office is look not just at outcomes, but what some of the contributing factors are around school quality that are impacting outcomes for our students. And so the answer to your question is kind of a yes and a no. We did do an equity audit. I just don't think we actually called it that when we did it.
Right.
I will also point out, if I can just go for one more second, that we do have a website, and it is schoolquality.virginia.gov, and that website allows any one member of the public to really go and conduct an equity audit if they're interested in doing that. You can look at data by school or division, and it allows you to display almost every data point that we collect on student outcomes by student group. And so I encourage anyone who's interested in kind of seeing how we have applied an equity lens and really try to provide some transparency around school quality for our constituents.
Thank you, Leah. I did post it in the chat box in case they missed it. Any other questions we have for our panelists? You have 6 whole minutes. And again, I really am appreciative of those of you who joined us this morning. I became director for the EAC-South in January, and this is the first webinar that we've hosted with this new, we have new staff, we have new points of focus outside of our religion, gender, national origin, and race, where we work with school districts, but we are really beginning to broaden our scope in that people like Leah Walker from the Virginia Department of Education, we're working with state agencies as well as school districts to broaden the conversation around the work that we can help impact the most. And we are really looking at a cross-sector between families, communities, teachers, administrators, regional service centers, and then state agencies to really begin a large-scale conversation about what equity in schools really looks like and how we can move the needle in that respect. And so the work is definitely broad, but it's so necessary. And so we're really beginning to think about different ways to engage with a variety of stakeholders. And I'm just so appreciative of all the people who have joined us today. And again, my heartfelt thanks to our fellow and our guests this morning. And if there are no other questions from our participants, I think we can go ahead and wrap it up. Once again, this website, the webpage, www.idraeac-south.org, will host the webinar's recording. I'm sure in a few days. Michelle's pretty good about getting those up quickly. And I will also enter my email in the chat box if you need any further information about IDRA or the EAC-South. Please feel free to contact me. And thank you, Morgan, Fernando, Leah, and Cristóbal once again. And this is Paula Johnson signing off for IDRA EAC-South. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.